History as it happens, August 6, 2022. Middle East on the brink.
Political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, we're getting reports, has been killed in Iran.
Israel said it had killed senior Hezbollah commander Fouad Shukr in a single strike in Beirut.
The U.S. is preparing to send fresh military assets to the Middle East, including a carrier strike group.
Urging people to communicate to the government of Iran that escalation is not in their interest and that we will defend Israel from attacks.
Iran and their regional allies have promised retaliation for the killing, which they've blamed on Israel.
All of us should understand the enormous damage that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his current extremist government coalition are doing to our relationship and to Israel's standing in the world.
Because when we stand together, something very simple happens. We win, they lose.
British, French and US embassies in Beirut have issued an urgent warning to their citizens to leave Lebanon.
As the US reportedly believes Iran will directly attack Israel as soon as today.
Israel's assassinations of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders is lighting a short fuse in the Middle East, guaranteeing violent retaliation from Iran, escalating the cycle of violence. A wider war is in no one's interest, but that doesn't mean one will automatically be avoided. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Americans are so tired of these unnecessary wars in the Middle East. Americans have no stomach for a war with Iran. It is in no way in U.S. interest to engage in war with Iran, and yet that is exactly what Netanyahu is trying to bring about.
Since 1948, the year the independent Jewish state of Israel was established, many wars have scarred the Middle East.
The city of Haifa and its harbor become the center of bitter conflict as the new Jewish state is born in the tense atmosphere of civil war. Haganah troops search for Arabs after capturing the city. Arab strong points are taken after being blasted to rubble. During the mopping up operation,
Israel fought a number of short wars over the decades. The Iran-Iraq War took up most of the 1980s. The Lebanese Civil War lasted 15 years. The United States still has troops in Iraq 21 years after invading. We could go on, of course, but on this long, bloody list, you won't find a full-scale regional war, a possibility that exists now. 10 months into Israel's war on Gaza, an act of revenge for Hamas's slaughter of Israeli civilians on October 7, there are the makings of a wider war, potentially involving the U.S. and Iran. This may not happen, I think it's unlikely, but it's bad enough to even be on the brink of a regional conflict. When there are no military solutions to the Middle East's problems, Israel cannot destroy Hamas, Hezbollah cannot defeat Israel, you get the point. In his speech to a joint session of Congress last month, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, despite facing a possible indictment for war crimes, received standing ovations right throughout.
Israel must stand together.
He sought to direct Americans' attention to the country he says is behind the region's problems, not Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Houthis. As troublesome as they are, it is Iran that must be stopped.
Yet in the heart of the Middle East, standing in Iran's way, is one proud pro-American democracy, my country, the State of Israel.
Netanyahu's been lobbying the United States to deal with Iran for decades. Here is a sample of his speeches to Western audiences over the years.
And as long as Iran persists in its dangerous quest for nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them, we shouldn't go back to business as usual with Iran. But evidently, giving Iran's murderous regime a clear path to the bomb is negotiable. This is unconscionable. Iran's regime is as radical as ever. Its cries of death to America, that same America that it calls the Great Satan, as loud as ever. They're at war with us. We never sought any enmity with Iran. They openly declare that their goal is to annihilate us every day.
Nothing could imperil our common future more than the arming of Iran with nuclear weapons.
He's spoken to the UN many times and now to Congress 4 times. But the U.S. has no interest in going to war with the Ayatollahs, and the maximum pressure campaigns, sanctions, and diplomatic isolation of past and current administrations have failed to bring Iran to its knees. But by assassinating a Hamas leader in Tehran on July 31st, Israel virtually guaranteed Iranian retaliation. and the U.S. has vowed to defend Israel against any attacks. Our guest in this episode contends the only person who benefits from escalation is Netanyahu himself. Annelle Sheline was a foreign affairs officer in the Office of Near East Affairs inside the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. State Department. She resigned in protest of President Biden's unconditional support for Israel's war of immense destruction in Gaza. She is now back at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft here in Washington. She is a political scientist and expert on the Middle East. Annelle Sheline, welcome to the Washington Times.
Thank you for having me.
So we have a lot to talk about, recent events, frightening events in the Middle East, but a couple of items about your recent decision to resign from the State Department because of President Biden's support, you say unconditional support of Israel in the war on Gaza. You've received a bit of attention for this, some interviews. You were on CNN and some other places. Were you surprised that the media sought you out to talk to you?
I was surprised. I had only been at the State Department for a year, and initially, although I was planning to resign over Gaza, I had not planned to go public because I didn't think anyone would care. I was in conversation with colleagues at the State Department who were dismayed by the Biden administration's policies, who asked if I would consider going public, and I said I would. And then, as you said, I got significantly more attention than I had expected. I think that may have been due to the timing. When I resigned, there had only been two other public resignations. One was Josh Paul in October of last year, so almost immediately after October 7th. And then the second was Tariq Habash, who was a political appointee and a Palestinian American from the Department of Education. So when I resigned in late March, I was only the third person. And I think by that point, really, public opinion had shifted, and many people were really shocked by the ways in which the Biden administration didn't seem to be doing almost anything to try to get Netanyahu and Israel to do more to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza.
You said you were haunted by what you saw happening in Gaza. What do you mean?
I mean, I think this is true of many people. You know, it's been almost 10 months at this point of these horrific images and videos coming through on social media. In terms of what I had access to inside the State Department was just more information, more systematic information. It really dominated what I was doing. Although I wasn't covering Israel-Palestine as one of the countries in my portfolio, it impacted everything I was doing in trying to work on promoting human rights in the Middle East. So a huge part of it was thinking about, I have a young daughter, and if she were to ask me in the future, you know, when she's aware of what was going on, you know, Mom, you were at the State Department when this was happening. Like, what did you do? I wanted to be able to tell her that I did something, that I stood up and spoke out, and I was no longer complicit.
The laws of war are complicated. I am not an international attorney. I've discussed this issue with experts on my show. Not all civilian casualties are automatically a war crime, but I think just from the visual perspective, you're looking at entire neighborhoods flattened. So when Israeli officials say they're doing all they can to protect civilians, and Hamas, and this is true, Hamas does hide within the civilian population, it doesn't square, though, with what we're seeing in these videos. Like I said, entire neighborhoods flattened.
This is part of what I was talking about the access to information I had inside the State Department. And part of this was paying very close attention to what Israeli government officials were saying in the aftermath of the horrific attacks by Hamas on southern Israel on October 7th. But we heard very quickly statements from these government and military officials that they intended to carry out a program of collective punishment. They referred to Palestinians as animals. They immediately cut off electricity and water. They control the territory of Gaza. As a result, it was very clear that what the Israeli government's policy was to do as much as they could to inflict damage and devastation upon the civilian population of Gaza. We know that the Israeli military is capable of carrying out very precise strikes. We saw this, although there's some contestation about what exactly happened, but my understanding of what happened is in the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas official who was killed in Tehran when he was attending the inauguration of Iran's new president, that he was killed by a missile attacking the building where he was sleeping. And that it was very precise. Very few other people were killed. We know Israel is capable of these very precise strikes. It has conducted other political assassinations in Iran, also in Lebanon, going after Hezbollah figures. So if Israel had wanted to, it could have conducted these similarly very precise strikes against members of Hamas, against the orchestrators of October 7th. And that is the furthest thing from what they did. Instead, they have pursued a policy of devastating Gaza. The number may be higher now, but when I last heard it was they've destroyed 80% of the buildings inside Gaza where 2 million people live. They're not letting in aid. They're not letting in food. Starvation is rampant. We have outbreaks of disease, including things like polio, which the World Health Organization had almost eliminated, scabies, these skin rashes. I mean, this is absolutely hell on earth for the civilian population who are not responsible for what happened.
Do you believe it's genocide?
I do. And this is informed by experts on genocide. And this is a legal definition. And there are people who have spent their life studying the legal definition of genocide who have made the determination this could plausibly be described as genocide.
Resigning from a position where you might be able to influence policy for the better must be difficult. Did you consider that now you are in no position to influence policy at all? Or did you just say, listen, I'm not influencing as it is, so there's no sense of being here?
Certainly. I tried to do what I could on the inside. The State Department has the dissent channel, which was set up in the aftermath of the Vietnam War to allow people inside the State Department to express their opposition to policies, to use their expertise to say why they think a given aspect of American foreign policy is the wrong decision. So I co-authored a dissent cable. I signed 2 other dissent cables. I participated in internal discussions within the State Department about this. And I stayed for about 6 months after October 7th. And at that point, I think it had become clear that, at least from my position, which again was quite junior, I had only been there a brief time, that there was really nothing I could do. And furthermore, that even those people who were in more senior positions above me, who I knew were opposed to this policy, who knew that this was undermining American security, this was generating significant anti-American sentiment in the region, this was undermining so much of the work that my department had done, for example, to try to advocate for human rights and rebuild some of America's credibility in the region. And furthermore, that Israel's behavior was threatening to drag the United States into a broader regional war. There were people far more senior than I who were making these arguments to the secretary and to the president, and yet none of this was getting through. And so if those senior officials were unable to have an impact, I knew that staying inside, I really was not going to be able to shift anything.
President Biden has applied soaring rhetoric and ideals to the national aspirations of, for instance, Ukrainians. He does not speak about Palestinian national aspirations in the same way, and really never has during his very long career in politics. He has been a stalwart defender of Israel. One more question about this, and we'll move on to what's going on now. But you said in your piece in the New Republic a couple of weeks ago that you were not surprised that Biden was stubbornly insisting on staying in the presidential race for 3 weeks before eventually surrendered after his June 27 debate, because you saw how stubborn he was being with the Israeli policy.
You know, when I wrote that piece, as you pointed out, there was still all this speculation of what was Biden going to do? Was he still going to insist on staying in the race, despite, at that point, significant pressure and anxiety from Democrats that they needed someone else to run against Trump? And what I wrote in the piece was, Biden is a politician who has established this reputation for empathy. He went through personal tragedy. He has presented himself as someone who cares about the working person in America. And yet he has demonstrated himself to be completely unmoved by the horrifying images, of starving children in Gaza, parents holding the bodies of their dead children. It's really shocking. Excuse me.
You can take a break. So it's okay. Take a breath. You can continue now. Part of what I've been frustrated about myself is that some people do not see Palestinians as worthy of life as they do other people, to be frank about it. But go ahead.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly, because the way that the mainstream media and much of political rhetoric describes Palestinians is to dehumanize them. And we've seen this for decades. So the point I was trying to make about Biden was that although he has this reputation for empathy, he has exhibited no empathy for the suffering of Palestinians. And so I was not so surprised that even though new information as far as his capacity to wage a successful campaign, it had increasingly become clear that he was not up to that task. Despite all this new information, he was not shifting his position. And so to me, that seemed quite similar, that even as more and more information had come in of the extent to which Israel was engaging in these horrific war crimes, that there were efforts by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice to say that Israel's behavior was violating international law, efforts at the UN, global public opinion had turned against Israel and against the United States. That in spite of all of this new information, Biden was completely unwilling to actually use America's significant leverage to tell Israel, you have to let in aid. You cannot continue to drop these massive 2,000-pound bombs on civilian areas. This is no longer acceptable. And not only as an empathetic human being, I, President Biden, and I'm willing to support this, this is also violating American laws. This was a big part of why I resigned as well, because of my concerns about the ways in which the Biden administration has completely abrogated American laws in ways that I think only contribute to these, what I see as sort of an erosion of American public trust in U.S. institutions, which I think is extremely damaging for us as a society and as a democracy.
The rest of the world does see it. When I did an episode a couple of months ago with Salim Yaqub, a historian at, I believe, USC, about how Ronald Reagan at one point pressured Menachem Begin to quit it when Israel invaded Beirut in 1982 and lay siege to that city, killing hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians. It came up in my preparation that during that war in 82, Senator Biden did not seem to care very much at all about the civilian deaths in Beirut. Lebanese and, of course, Yasser Arafat's people were there as well. But Beirut was destroyed by Israel in that invasion. So we're going to talk about Lebanon here. Thank you for recounting for us what was obviously a very difficult decision for you as a professional working in the State Department and also as a human being. So it has been a possibility that the war could escalate really since October. You and some of your colleagues at the Quincy Institute, among others who've been following this, have been warning us about a wider war escalation for the last however many months. Why do you think it's more possible now?
This is certainly something that my colleagues at Quincy and others have been warning about for a long time. And, one of the questions is, well, if this is the objective, why hasn't it happened sooner? I think part of that is due to the fact that, like many militaries, when they launch an operation, they think it's going to go smoothly. They think it'll be over quickly. And invariably, that is not the case. So I think that the Israeli military has found it far more challenging to try to eliminate Hamas in the Gaza Strip than they anticipated. And this is part of why we haven't yet seen the transition. They don't want to open up the northern front against Hezbollah while they're still trying to conduct these military operations. And again, this ongoing policy of dropping such massive amounts of ordnance on Gaza. This is part of why when Netanyahu came to Congress, he said he wanted more tools to do the job faster, despite the fact that Biden and this Congress have sent massive, unprecedented numbers of weapons and money to support this.
You cited Robert Pape, who wrote an article for Foreign Affairs, Hamas is Winning is the title of that article, how Israel has dropped more tons of bombs on Gaza than were dropped on London, Dresden, and Hamburg in all of World War II, those three cities. So, yeah, one issue here, to your point about the difficulty Israel is having in defeating Hamas or destroying Hamas, which might be impossible. An article in the New York Times, How Hamas is Fighting in Gaza, Tunnels, Traps, and Ambushes, points out how the Israeli military has been caught off guard about the extent of the tunnel network and how much difficulty they're having finding the Hamas guerrillas, and the reliance on airstrikes rather than going in there with a large land force, if you will. Now, they did invade with 40,000 troops, the IDF, at the beginning of the conflict. 350 Israeli soldiers have been killed, which is a relatively low number, and maybe that tells us something about how they're fighting the war.
I do agree that it is worth highlighting the extremity of what Israel has done, especially when thinking about something like the bombing campaigns, what the Allies did to Dresden and Hamburg, as well as what the Nazis did to London. That all of that combined is less than what Israel has dropped on Gaza. Truly shocking to contemplate. In terms of the difficulty of what Israel is trying to accomplish here, I do think it's worth keeping in mind that because under international law, the Gaza Strip is an occupied territory. I mean, this is what we call them, the occupied territories. As soon as the attacks on October 7th ceased, as soon as, let's say, on October 8th, once there were no longer active Hamas militants operating inside of Israel, Israel no longer legally had the justification of self-defense because it occupies Gaza. So even though it continues and American officials continue to use this tired line, Israel has the right to defend itself, under international law, as of October 8th, that was no longer true because Israel occupies Palestine and occupies Gaza. So all of this ongoing justification is a violation of international law. And I think the underlying point here is that Israel has made this decision to continue to pursue violence against the Palestinian people. And what October 7th showed is that these decades of occupation, decades of violence and apartheid have not delivered security for the people of Israel, certainly not for the people of Palestine. And so the way forward here is a two-state solution or a one-state solution, giving equality to the Palestinian people in a combined state of Israel-Palestine. But it should have been the conclusion after many previous attacks, but especially after October 7th, that what Israel is doing is only making it more insecure, is only going to cost more Israeli lives. My concern now is that from Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective, he faces real political consequences if the violence ends. And so his interests are best served by opening up a front against Hezbollah, possibly getting into a war with Iran, because President Biden has shown over and over again that there are no red lines, that he's going to do nothing other than just provide this unconditional support. This only serves Netanyahu's interest. This does not serve Israel's interest, certainly not the interests of Palestinians, and not Americans. And not Biden's or those of his party, because the American public are so tired of these unnecessary wars in the Middle East that if Biden were to get the U.S. dragged into another war, it's almost a complete certainty that his party would lose the election.
Just yesterday, the president and Vice President Harris told Prime Minister Netanyahu that the U.S. continues to support Israel's efforts to defend itself, the term that you object to, against ballistic missiles and drones with new defensive military deployments, and Biden reaffirmed his commitment to Israel's defense in a call with the prime minister. That was the same day that an Israeli airstrike on a Gaza school compound killed 15 people, including children. Israel said that Hamas was using it as a hideout for commanders. A couple of things you mentioned there about whether this is justified or not. Even if your position is Israel does have a right to go into Gaza, say, the way the United States invaded Afghanistan, because that's where the attackers were. There are still laws about the conduct of war, distinction between civilians and combatants, which is difficult in this case, admittedly, right? And proportionality. Again, I'm not a lawyer here, but it does not seem to me that Israel is following those two standards, if you will.
Absolutely. So, right, as you say, if we are going to accept the premise that Israel has a right to defend itself in the territory that it occupies, it is absolutely the case that Israel is not following the laws of war in terms of proportionality. In addition, although so often the media talks about the Hamas strategy of human shields, we've seen Israel do this itself time and time again. We saw that horrific video of the Palestinian man strapped to the hood of an IDF truck. We see this over and over again, where the IDF uses Palestinians to go ahead of them into tunnels. So if Israel is going to criticize Hamas for using human shields, then the IDF does the exact same thing.
Yeah, both sides have committed war crimes. This war is horrific, period. And I don't think any side can claim the moral high ground here. So as far as, the possibility of escalation, is it your view that Netanyahu, the IDF, that they're trying to provoke a wider war? Because that's in no one's interest, and it's not even clear to me that Israel could fight a two-front war.
The only person who would benefit from a wider war is Netanyahu, because he faces legal charges for corruption and bribery. He knows that as soon as the violence stops, he is going to be held accountable. He's going to lose the elections. His coalition is going to fall apart. 72% of Israelis no longer want him to be prime minister. So from his perspective, he needs the violence to continue. And in order to allow that to happen, because of the rate at which Israel is dropping its massive stockpile of weapons on Gaza, he needs additional ongoing unconditional support from the United States. And so this is why he is behaving so provocatively. Although there's been this big narrative about Hezbollah shooting rockets into Israel, the actual numbers are that Israel is responsible for 83% of the transborder rockets going at Hezbollah, and Hezbollah, therefore, has only sent 17% in response.
Why do you think Hezbollah is showing relative restraint here? Because this low-level cross-border rocket fire has been going back and forth for quite a while, but it hasn't blown up yet into a full-scale conflict.
This is what we heard from leaders in Iran and Hezbollah after the October 7th attacks, which was that they were not aware of these attacks, they were not consulted. Hamas, it's most likely they didn't even tell some of their political representatives in places like Qatar. So, example, Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political figure who was killed in Tehran by Israel just a few days ago, he likely didn't know about the fact that October 7th was being planned. And so from Iran and Hezbollah's perspective, it's not their fight. Hamas brought this on themselves, but they're really not interested in engaging in an all-out war with Israel, which is quite powerful on its own, has nuclear weapons, but also they know has this backing from the United States. As you pointed out, then Senator Biden back in the 80s expressed almost no concerns about the lives of Lebanese and citizens in Beirut who were being killed when President Reagan himself saw that as really beyond the pale and told Israel that it needed to stop.
He told Begin it was a Holocaust, which Begin did not appreciate because he lost family members in the Holocaust. But yeah, Reagan was correct to believe that what was happening then, again, this was 1982, but he did not believe that what Israel was doing was in the U.S. national interest, because Reagan was trying to find a peaceful solution to the Lebanese civil war and also the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We're not seeing any exertion of leverage at all here. Let's return to the U.S. leverage issue in a bit. The leader of Hamas's armed wing, Mohammed Daif, might be dead. There was an airstrike in mid-July. Israel claim they got him, but we're not sure. As you mentioned, Hamas's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Tehran. Hezbollah's Fouad Shukr was assassinated by Israel in Beirut. How damaging are these losses to each organization, Hamas and Hezbollah?
My understanding is that although it is certainly symbolically significant, and in particular, it is humiliating for Iran, for Israel to have come in on the occasion of their inauguration of their new president, to have killed this figure in their capital city, putting Iran in a position where they're really forced to respond, which gets back to what I was saying about how Netanyahu's interests are best served by the violence expanding. So in terms of what impact this will have on the broader organizations, it has never in the past mattered significantly to kill a single member of a terrorist movement or really any movement. There are always people waiting in the wings to take over. This sort of gets at the underlying fiction of Israel's sort of horrifically named policy of mowing the grass, where they periodically just go in and kill people. Because this perpetuates the cycle of violence, this was already the case that there were generations of young Palestinians who'd seen family members killed in previous bouts of violence who then grow up to become members of these terrorist organizations.
That's right, yes. Everyone who dies has relatives, so...
Exactly. But then when you think about the devastation of what's been done to Gaza, in some ways it does seem that what Israel is trying to do is to engage in such a level of genocide that there simply are not people left behind to carry out revenge. If that is the case, it is truly horrifying that the United States continues to support this. Arguably, it is not possible, or the level of violence that Israel would have to engage in to actually kill the entire population of Gaza. I truly hope the world would not stomach that happening.
Or just create conditions. So I don't think they're trying to kill every last Palestinian in Gaza. They are creating conditions, however, where Gazans will simply not be able to thrive and survive. Maybe that's a differentiation without a difference. But there is no plan for what happens after this horrible war is over. I mean, who's going to rebuild Gaza? 80% of the population's been displaced. You mentioned a figure before about the number of buildings that have been destroyed, schools, hospitals. If you don't mind, I want to just return to a point about restraint on the part of Hezbollah. I read a few months ago a remarkable essay by an Israeli, Shlomi Eldar, who interviewed leaders in Hamas about what was Hamas trying to do on October 7th. Why'd they want to bring the house down? They had to know there'd be a massive retaliation. There were some elements within Hamas who, when they learned of this plan, thought it was crazy, and they left the Gaza Strip. They're in Egypt. That's where this journalist was able to interview them. Whereas the architects of the attack thought that they could defeat Israel. And as we know, Hamas's charter and the amendment to the charter is pretty radical, is pretty extreme. In other words, there are members of Hamas who would like to destroy the state of Israel. As for Hezbollah, I don't know as much about their ideology, but clearly, as you mentioned before, they are showing restraint here because of the memory of the 2006 conflict, right?
First, just to go back.
That was a very long question. Sorry, Annelle, but go ahead. Yeah, take that one piece at a time.
To go back in the aftermath of Oslo and the peace process that was supposed to sort of set up the foundations for establishing an independent state of Palestine, Netanyahu and the right-wing members of Israeli society were very opposed to that. They didn't want to have sort of this legitimate state that the international community would then recognize. And so from their perspective, they are best served by having terrorists on the other side, by having Hamas and other extremists on the other side, because then they can maintain this narrative that there's no one to negotiate with.
A divided Palestinian leadership, too. That's been an obvious aim of the policy.
Exactly. Yeah. To the extent that Netanyahu was sending money to Hamas, was in touch with members of Hamas, because from his perspective, the worst thing would be for the moderates and the peacemakers to come back into power, because then he would have a very hard time justifying this ongoing level of violence and continuing to say that there's no alternative here. The only alternative is violence. So to your point about Hezbollah, the 2006 conflict was significant, but I think memories go back a lot further than that. Like you were saying, to the Lebanese Civil War, to the 1980s, Israel's long-term occupation of southern Lebanon. From Hezbollah's perspective, they know that Israel is capable of massive and devastating levels of violence, as we've witnessed in Gaza, and they would really prefer not to. They don't see this as their fight. But as I said, Israel has engaged in the vast majority of cross-border attacks, displacing 90,000 people in Lebanon. And likewise, Hezbollah attacks have displaced about 60,000 people in northern Israel.
Yeah, that seems to get overlooked, those two numbers. 90,000 on one side, 60,000 people displaced from violence on the other. I mean, it's getting more attention now, obviously, with what's happening, but go ahead.
So from Hezbollah's perspective and from Iran's perspective, they would really rather not get into this fight. But we see Israel over the past several months continuing to engage in these very provocative actions. On April 1st, when Israel attacked Damascus and killed several members of the IRGC at the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Iran retaliated, sending drones and missiles, many of which were intercepted, including with assistance from the United States and Jordan.
That was like a stage-managed retaliation, a retaliation that was designed not to do a lot of damage.
Exactly. So at this point, much of the attacks back and forth have been symbolic, but all managed to prevent this from escalating. And the Biden administration has said over and over again that this is their primary objective. They brought aircraft carriers into the Mediterranean. They've tried to manage the threat from the Houthis in Yemen. But all this to say, the Biden administration keeps insisting that they are trying to prevent regional war and sort of pat themselves on the back for thus far being able to do so. And yet, what all of these groups have said, what Hezbollah has said and Iran and the Houthis, is that as soon as there's a ceasefire in Gaza, they are not interested in a broader war. They will stop, they will stand down. Instead of the Biden administration exerting its significant leverage on Netanyahu and on the state of Israel by saying, we are going to impose U.S. laws, you are blocking U.S. humanitarian aid, your troops are engaged in gross violations of human rights. This is all very well documented, and under U.S. law, you are no longer eligible to receive security assistance, and that would force Israel to stop trying to expand this war, specifically Netanyahu from trying to expand this war. Instead, Biden just keeps sending more weapons, which encourages Netanyahu to just keep pushing things further and further.
How important is the U.S. aid to Israel? Can Israel continue to prosecute the war without U.S. assistance?
Not at all. 78% of Israeli weapons come from the United States. As we already discussed, Israel has been going through its munitions at an unprecedented rate. Yeah. The justification that I heard inside the State Department for why it was necessary for the U.S. to keep sending these weapons was it was needed as a deterrent against Hezbollah. But instead, Israel just keeps behaving provocatively towards Hezbollah, keeps crossing red lines, things like when Biden said, look, if you go into Rafah, we're not going to be involved in that. We're not going to send you any more weapons. Israel goes into Rafah, conducts these horrific attacks on civilians, and then has the audacity to say in Congress that almost no civilians were killed in Rafah when we had the numbers coming out of Israeli operations in Rafah were, 100 civilians a day throughout, over the course of more than a month that operation was taking place in May and June.
Galling. I found this speech galling, to be honest with you, being lectured.
And lecturing Americans on our fundamental freedoms, on our First Amendment right to engage in protest. As Americans, we have the right to speak out against our government when we think it's doing something wrong. We have the right to free speech, to criticize.
So these protesters burn American flags even on the 4th of July. And I wish to salute the fraternity brothers at the University of North Carolina who protected the American flag against these anti-Israel protesters. For all we know, Iran is funding the anti-Israel protests that are going on right now outside this building. Not that many, but they're there, and throughout the city. Well, I have a message for these protesters. When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots.
These brave young people on college campuses who, thousands of whom were arrested, the level of state violence against college students. What we saw, for example, on January 6th, when people were trying to overturn an American election, they were not subject to the same level of violence from the state.
I want to return to Netanyahu's speech and his remarks about Iran. He really did make this about Iran. He said, when we fight Iran, we are fighting the most radical and murderous enemy of the United States. He tied everything that's happening to Iran. That's been a pattern of his. About Hezbollah and its origins, I have a podcast coming up about that. But we know they emerged in the early 1980s as a Lebanese militia to resist the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. But now, today, Hezbollah is a political party as well. It's called a state within a state. So when we talk about Israel going to war against Hezbollah, Hezbollah is not a country. We kind of forget that Lebanon is there, but Lebanon has no president. Its prime minister, Najib Mikati, is a caretaker. The parliament is very divided. Its population is deeply impoverished, and there's enormous amounts of corruption there. So the EU's been sending money, for instance, to Lebanon to try to help with hunger, etc., and the money is not getting to the people who need it.
I mean, unfortunately, Lebanon's dysfunction goes back to, in some ways, the decisions made in the post-colonial era to set up the Lebanese political system, because Lebanon does contain a Shia Muslim population, a Sunni Muslim population, and a Christian population. And so the political system that the French helped to set up as they were leaving was one that artificially empowers the Christian and Sunni population, despite the fact that the Shia population of Lebanon was already a significant portion of the population and has now demographically grown significantly. So we have this sort of artificial political system imposed by a colonial power that has never been changed, because the Sunni Lebanese and the Christian Lebanese are uninterested in losing their political power. So this generates some fundamental instabilities within Lebanon. There was the Lebanese Civil War, for example. Obviously, Lebanon's proximity to Israel and Palestine has meant that there have been a significant amount of spillover from Palestinian militias over time that have been based there. It's been subject to violence from Israel. Unfortunately, this tends to be overlooked, and the level of dysfunction.
And it leads to a situation where Israel can fire airstrikes into Gaza, which is an occupied territory, and then fire airstrikes into Lebanon, which is basically a failed state. Usually when you fire rockets or drop bombs on a sovereign nation. Well, actually, this has come up with some Trump supporters have talked about attacking cartels in Mexico, as if we could just bomb Mexico, a sovereign country, and get away with it. But it does seem like Israel believes it has this leeway, or doesn't really feel retaliation, because Lebanon is, as I mentioned, basically a failed state.
Certainly, I mean, in many ways, what's unfortunate is I do think we are getting to a point now in the international system where it's increasingly plausible for certain figures in the Republican Party to say something like, we should launch missiles at Mexican drug cartels, because of the ways that the United States is so habituated to violating international law that Americans aren't even used to sort of thinking about the ways in which, well, that would violate international law, and the U.S. is actually constrained by those laws, because it's not. The United States continues to behave in ways that violate international law, and Israel, as we have seen, behaves in a very similar manner, and the U.S. provides political cover for it at the UN in these international fora. So, as you said, Israel has thus far faced few consequences for its attacks on Hezbollah. And this reflects restraint on the part of Hezbollah, because, as I've said, they're not interested in sort of launching this broader regional war. And yet these recent attacks, these are symbolically very humiliating. They further goad both Hezbollah and Iran to take action.
Provocative. It's an assassination, a cross-border assassination. And a couple more things, and we'll shift to Netanyahu's speech now, just a couple more questions. He is obviously very unpopular in Israel, as you said, for his many failings, including the failure to defend the country on October 7th and his mow the grass strategy. He did tie all of this to Iran. This has been a pattern of his. Your colleague at Quincy, Trita Parsi, has written about this, that during the 1980s, Iran and Israel, I mean, they weren't chummy necessarily, but they weren't sworn enemies out to annihilate each other. But it was in the 1990s, Trita has said, where Israel started to lobby or pressure the U.S. government to view Iran as an existential threat. Is this the same playbook that Netanyahu is now using, for instance, in his speech to Congress?
Certainly. It's somewhat unprecedented. It's completely unprecedented for a foreign leader to have addressed Congress now 4 times. Netanyahu he beat Winston Churchill
He broke the tie 3.
Exactly. So, and this speaks to the power of the Israel lobby inside Congress. The money that the Israel lobby sends to politicians on both sides of the aisle. As you pointed out, Israel has been lobbying Congress and the U.S. government to view Iran as a threat that the U.S. needs to deal with, because from Israel's perspective, they don't want to take on Iran directly. They want America to do it. American interests are not served by trying to take on Iran. This would be a complete catastrophe, far greater than the expense and loss of American lives that we witnessed in Iraq. You know, at that point, the Iraqi government was somewhat debilitated. We saw it fall quite quickly, and then it metastasized into this more than a decade of counterinsurgency. If the U.S. were to go after Iran, this is a very different government. This is a very different circumstances. Iran is stronger.
As some people are, or have been for many years, proposing. This is not just an abstraction. The John Boltons and groups in the United States, think tanks who push this idea, and as you say, Israelis as well. To me, the idea of invading Iran, I mean, that's just totally insane. But go ahead.
It's just somewhat maddening because, you know, in the aftermath of 9/11, America was desperate to go after those that had done this to us. We went after the Taliban in Afghanistan, ended up spending 20 years there, nation building. You know, that was clearly a failure.
Iran actually helped the United States in some ways. It was very quiet, didn't get a lot of attention in Afghanistan, but go ahead.
They did, yeah,
Yes.
against the Taliban. And furthermore, the invasion of Iraq, although we now know was based on lies and a fabricated campaign to use this sort of false intelligence to pretend that there were weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein was holding. You know, this was all based on lies. And then the United States went into Iraq, got bogged down. There are still U.S. troops in Iraq doing the counter-ISIS mission. Americans are so tired of these unnecessary wars in the Middle East. Americans have no stomach for a war with Iran. It is in no way in U.S. interest to engage in war with Iran, and yet that is exactly what Netanyahu is trying to bring about.
How? By giving a speech? I guess that's one way. The missile strikes to eliminate leaders. I mean, that's not enough, though. I just don't see that happening. I don't see how he could possibly do that. Even if someone believes that Israel is fighting a just war, pretty much all the experts I've read in the last 10 months or however many months it's been have said there's simply no military solution to this conflict. I mean, that is the fundamental truth here. So we can debate this tactic or that tactic or who's to blame for this, who's to blame for that. On all sides, this applies. Hamas, Israel, Hezbollah. There is no way to settle this problem through violence. But as you said, Netanyahu's never been interested in a two-state solution. So to me, what a possible solution might be, or to you, a two-state solution, that is not a solution to them. They're trying to avoid that. What we see as the solution is something that, especially this Israeli government, the Israeli right wing, does not view that as a solution. They're actively trying to prevent a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. I answered my own question, but go ahead, Annelle.
Well, you know, I think just thinking about what Israel and Israeli society have become, you know, we saw in the past few days where, given the horrific violence that has been committed against Palestinian detainees in the context of the war on Gaza, and prior to that, but especially since October 7th, finally we saw an effort to try to hold accountable members of the IDF that had engaged in a rape of a Palestinian prisoner that was so horrifying. He had broken ribs, a ruptured intestine. He had been so injured by their sexual violence against him that in order to prevent the ICC from getting involved or other international institutions to try to bring Israel to justice, Israel decided, you know, Israeli authorities decided they were going to go in and hold these IDF soldiers accountable. And so to prevent that accountability, we saw mobs of other soldiers going in, and the military police were brought in to try to restore order. So this was playing out in social media, that we had mobs of Israelis rioting for the right to rape Palestinian prisoners. This is where we've gotten in terms of what the Israeli right has produced as far as the level of dehumanization of Palestinians. I recently had a conversation with an Israeli peace activist named Maoz Inan, who was here in D.C., put together a counter event that many of the Democratic members of Congress who boycotted the Netanyahu speech instead attended this event with Maoz and a Palestinian peace activist, Aziz Abu Sada. So I was asking Maoz, you know, so what do we do even if Netanyahu loses power? You know, maybe things change a little bit, but you still have this radicalized Israeli society, which view Palestinians as not fully human and as, you know, the legitimate targets of such horrific violence. You know, what do you do with that? And his response to me was that while it's true that over time, it seems the message from the Israeli right has been that the left has not been able to deliver security, and we are only able to achieve security through this extreme violence against Palestinians and this level of apartheid. But what he said was Israelis just want security. They were traumatized by October 7th. They're traumatized by the Holocaust. The narratives that play in Israeli society perpetually present them and the Jewish people throughout history as the victims, such that they really struggle to view the ways in which they are victimizing others. And so his answer was help guarantee security, show that through peace comes security. And, he had this level of optimism that for me, as someone who's studied this and has really just grown so horrified by everything that has been happening and truly pessimistic, it did help to restore some of my belief that there is a way out of this. But the only way to get there is for the United States to stop arming this extreme right-wing Israeli government, which is engaging in these violations that break international law, break U.S. law, but much more concerningly, from an American perspective, are really likely to get us bogged down in yet another war in the Middle East.
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produce this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it. Those outsiders who have fed the flames of civil war in Lebanon for so many years need to learn that the fire will consume them too if it is not put out. And we must all rededicate ourselves to the cause of peace.
President Reagan, 1982, after the massacres at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut. On our next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to return to that conflict, the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, as we explore the origins of Hezbollah, the militant Lebanese militia that now holds seats in the Lebanese parliament, backed by Iran. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.